Good evening. What a way to start spring break, right? So either people don't have any homework to do, or you're just anxious as heck to listen to tonight's program. So let me just welcome you. I'm Alan Solomon. I'm the Dean of the Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life. It's a pleasure to welcome you tonight to this forum with Patty Wen, Adrian Walker, and Tod Wallach, who are members of the Boston Globe's award-winning investigative unit, the Spotlight team. Before we begin, I want to thank my Tisch colleagues, and especially Special Projects Administrator Jess Burns over there for the hard work on tonight's forum, as well as Jen McAndrew and Barbara Rubel. Thank you all, and thanks all of you for taking time out to be with us. It's been a rather extraordinary start to this semester's Distinguished Speaker Series. We had Al Gore several weeks ago and Senator Susan Collins. In 2 weeks, in partnership with Tufts Hillel, we will welcome to campus Cecile Richards, President of Planned Parenthood. And in April, our distinguished speaker will be Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. Tonight, we turn our attention to the Fourth Estate, to the media. By now, it seems almost redundant to underscore the importance of a strong and independent press at this particular moment in the civic and political life of our nation. And yet the point cannot be overstated. The media is the people's window into problems in our communities, through which to view the decisions of our leaders, and into facts that create the foundation for how we approach the world. At Tisch College, we believe that being well-informed and engaging responsible in an ever more complicated media landscape is the first step to effective participation in civic and democratic life. Tisch College is the co-sponsor of academic courses like this semester's New Media, New Politics, last fall's Media and Environment, Creating Change, which was taught by the moderator of tonight's panel, Julie Dobrow. We also provide summer fellowships at places like WLIW, a public television station in New York. The research team at Tisch College has long studied and advocated for media literacy as a crucial component of civic education. Their scholarship suggests that we teach young people not only to identify reliable news, but to create media that amplifies their voices and tells their stories. And we put this knowledge into practice to effect real change. CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, is partnering with media organizations on a new campaign, 22 by 20. The mission of this is to ensure that the 22 million Americans who turn 18 and become newly eligible voters by 2020 will be well-informed and engaged as they prepare to cast their first ballots. Extraordinary journalists across the country and around the globe embrace their civic responsibility to help us understand the world and to shine a light on the truth. And when the truth is hidden, we rely on investigative reporters to doggedly seek it out and expose it for all to see. The Boston Globe Spotlight team is the oldest continuously running investigative unit in American print media. For more than 50 years, Spotlight's Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting has exposed corruption and fraud, sounded the alarm on public health crises, and shined a light on public servants who take advantage of the public they are charged with serving. The Spotlight unit is best known for its coverage of the rampant sexual abuse of children in the Boston's Catholic Church, as featured in the 2015 Oscar-winning film entitled Spotlight. Last year, the Spotlight team published a special 7-part series on race in Boston that explored how prejudice and inequity persist across all sectors in the Commonwealth, from the hospital room to the ballpark to the college campus. We're pleased to be joined tonight by 3 members of the Spotlight team. Patricia Wen is the editor of Spotlight. She took over the investigative unit after several decades as a reporter at the Globe covering social service, legal, and medical issues. She has twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, once in 2004 for feature writing, and is part of a team in 2013 for National Reporter. On 2 occasions, she has won the Casey Medal for coverage of children and family issues. Adrian Walker is a Boston Globe columnist focusing on politics and social issues. He began at the paper in 1989 as a reporter and became a columnist in 1998. He wrote one of the most discussed pieces in last year's series, A Bigot in the Stands, about the legacy of racism in Boston sports. I credit Adrian for helping hatch the idea for tonight's forum over a seafood lunch we shared at a local restaurant. Tod Wallach is an investigative reporter and data analyst on the Globe Spotlight team. He won national awards for his work on public records in 2016 and has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize 3 times. Before joining the Globe in 2007, Tod worked with the San Francisco Chronicle, the Boston Herald, and other publications. And finally, moderating tonight's conversation is Julie Dobrow, Tisch College Senior Fellow for Media and Civic Engagement and Senior Lecturer at the Elliott Pearson Department of Child Study and Human Development at Tufts. Much of Julie's work centers on the content and effect of media on children, on issues of gender and ethnicity in media, and on the intersection of history and communication studies. Along with 2 of her colleagues, she recently published a widely read article entitled, Why It's So Important to See Diverse TV and Movie Characters. Julie has worked professionally as a journalist and runs workshops on media literacy for parents, teachers, and students. Her writing on these and other topics has appeared in outlets like the Boston Globe, Magazine, and HuffPost. Please join me in welcoming Julie Dobrow and tonight's guests, Patty Wen, Adrian Walker, and Tod Wallach.
Thank you, Alan. Historically, investigative journalism has proven to be an indispensable safeguard for democracy. And here we are today, in the midst of an unprecedented, some would say daily set of challenges to basic and verifiable truths, as we face mind-blowing reports that swirl all around us about foreign interference in our election system, and so much more. Arguably, deep and insightful journalism is more important than it ever was. It was iconic newsman Edward R. Murrow, whose papers we have here at Tufts, who brought down Senator Joseph McCarthy. It was 2 then unknown reporters from the Washington Post that exposed the Watergate scandal. Their names, Woodward and Bernstein, are now almost synonymous with investigative reporting. Some have suggested that today, in the era of Donald Trump, we have re-energized and reinvigorated investigative reporting. So my first question to our esteemed panelist here is, what do you think about that? Is it the time that we're in that really has energized investigative reporting like we haven't seen before?
I just came back from a journalism conference run by investigative reporters and editors called NICAR, that's dedicated to data journalism. And they set a record for more than 1,200 people that were there. And at the main IRE conference on investigative reporting, they recently set another record. So there's huge investments in investigative reporting. And we're seeing huge increases in readership. The number of online subscribers to the Globe is at a high around 100,000. I'm not sure they are close to 100,000, I believe. The Washington Post and New York Times have been setting records in terms of subscribership. So we're seeing huge hunger for news and for investigative reports and for really digging deep. And it's ironic, given that we're at a time that people talk about fake news and distrust of the media, because we're doing more good journalism than ever, because in order to distinguish ourselves, I think that we really need to do substantial reporting, and I think readers are hungering for it and showing a willingness to pay for news even online, as long as it's substantial and well reported.
I will say that, I mean, that's a silver lining, I think, for sure, to the sort of crazy political time that we live in. But I will say, and I was saying this to the journalism students we spoke to earlier today, that I'm not so sure, though, that despite lots of excellent investigative reporting being done in a lot of different publications, that the segment of our American society that contributes to all the fake news and all the conspiracy theories and so forth, that they really care what we write anyway. I'm not so sure it really makes a difference to that segment. So there's almost this, I feel like we're kind of the beneficiaries of this greater attention to investigative reporting, and I really hope it continues, whoever's in the White House. But I'm not so sure it actually is going to make a difference to that particular contingent of society.
No, I agree with both of those, but both of those points. But I will say that I think there's a huge thirst for it.
Yes.
That that exceeds what was there 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
As we wake up every day to what used to be outrageous stories, and every day we see something that would have been a career-ending scandal and wonder why it isn't, and people want to know more and more about what's really going on and where it's all going.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So, as Alan mentioned, Spotlight has been around for a long time. And I wonder if you can talk about its beginnings. Why did the Boston Globe feel that it was necessary to have a team of investigative reporters? And perhaps also you could talk a little bit about how Spotlight has evolved over the years.
Well, Spotlight was started 50 years ago. I believe there was an editor at the time, Tim Leland. Tell me if I got this history right, Todd. But he actually went to visit a newspaper in London. Was it The Guardian? Or anyway, he was there in London, and he saw that a paper there had this model of an investigative news team that was sort of segregated from the rest of the newsroom, and they did investigations. And so he sort of imported that idea into the Globe and convinced the editor at the time to try it. And at that time, too, the idea was that it was a team. I believe even then there was not bylines to it. It's like you worked for the Spotlight team and you tried to uncover wrongdoing. Basically, going forward, there has been, if you've seen the movie, that's pretty much most of the time what it's like. Spotlight is away from the main newsroom, and their projects are secret. There was usually an editor and like 3 reporters. Like when I was a reporter first, my stint as a reporter in Spotlight, it was like in the movie. You had 1 editor, 3 reporters, you were in the basement pretty much, and you did your thing, and you didn't talk to other people about what you were doing. It has since, times change, and now we have, and to the credit of the Globe, the Spotlight team now has basically 6 reporters. And we even can bring in new reporters sometimes for special assignments. And so now, we can do more projects. We might do 2 at once rather than just 1 at a time. But again, and we are now in the main newsroom, but we are off in a corner, so it's a little bit more private.
Well, we're off in a corner, but we're not in the basement.
We're not in the basement.
It's like Spotlight was for 30 years, so that part's good.
Yeah.
And, and one of the things, not only is it physically segregated, but it's reporters who aren't doing other things,
Yes.
It's not like State House reporters trying to do an investigation while they also do their daily journalism. You can really take 3 months or 6 months, as we did in this case, and really focus on something and dive deep into it without having other responsibilities, which is one of the things I think that makes it unique.
Yeah.
So when I first joined the Spotlight team in 2013, I was half-time on the Spotlight team and half-time on a Metro investigative team upstairs, and so I'd literally go back and forth. So the Spotlight team was in this sort of dungeon in the mezzanine, so it was really between 2 different floors, off in this corner that would be almost impossible for an outsider to find. It really was hidden away. And by the way, it looks exactly like it does in the movie, even though they recreated it in Toronto. The outside scenes were filmed in Boston, but the inside scenes were filmed in a model of the newsroom in the Spotlight room in Toronto. And it is really important to be able to spend time focusing on stories. And so that is a great luxury and a great opportunity that people have on Spotlight, to be able to really focus and dig deep into an issue instead of just trying to work on it in between the daily stories.
I remember when I started at the Globe in 1989, the Metro editor was giving me a tour of the building, and we walked past the Spotlight office, and he said, "That's the Spotlight team. They're the investigative team. Never ask what they're doing. It's none of your business." And that was all I needed to know about Spotlight. We were done. So that's what it used to be like.
So, Patty and Adrian, I know that both of you started out doing other things in journalism. And Todd, I don't know, have you always been an investigative reporter?
Aspiring, but no. No,
Okay,
no.
so let me ask each of you then, if you could talk a little bit about what you did before and how you found your way to Spotlight.
Okay, you mean what we did even before I
In
began
journalism.
in journalism,
Right.
before I entered journalism, even. Okay. Well, when I graduated from college, I studied modern Chinese history, and I thought I was going to go into international relations. And anyway, I happened to have an internship at this place called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And while I was there, I was assigned to a unit that was primarily former foreign correspondents, and they would be there for like a year to write a book or an op-ed piece. But I started listening to their lives and their work, and I just thought it was fascinating. And I began to feel like I didn't really want to do foreign policy. It seemed too abstract, and I really liked the idea of, writing stories that you would see people on the subway reading and having sort of a more, local impact. So then I basically began to apply to a bunch of different places, and my first opportunity was at the Star-Ledger in Newark, New Jersey. So I became a reporter there for a couple years, and I worked at the Stanford Advocate for a couple years, and then came to the Globe. That's my journey.
I'd say I kind of stumbled into journalism halfway through college. I was an English major down at Florida International University, and I thought I was going to be an English professor, which, thank God, never happened. And basically on a dare, I got onto the college newspaper staff. I was sitting in a bar one night complaining about the school newspaper, which was like my Wednesday night ritual. And one of my friends turned to me and said, "Well, if you know so much about journalism, why don't you go write some stories?" And I did. And I totally fell in love with it and became a reporter. And my first paper was in Miami, where I was a police reporter, basically covering murders every night. And then I came to the Globe, and at the Globe, I was a general assignment reporter, and then I started doing politics, which I did for years. I did City Hall and State House. I was deputy political editor. I actually got to know Alan in his days running the Democratic National Committee, when he was raising millions of dollars for everybody who ran for office. And then I became a columnist in 1998. Spotlight for me has been a cameo. This was a one project thing for me because supposedly I knew something about this subject.
So I guess I'm the exception that I deliberately went to journalism school. I went to Northwestern and wanted to be a journalist. I never met a journalist, so it could have been a disaster, and I could have quickly switched majors because I didn't really know. It's just what I imagined. I liked to write, and I was interested in news and liked to learn. But as I got into it more and more, I liked it, and I did a bunch of internships, writing to newspapers across the country. I could have papered my dorm room wall with rejection letters called bullet letters, but one of the letters acceptance was an internship at the Dayton Daily News in Ohio. So I interned there and wound up getting a job after college. My first job was running the Greene County Bureau east of Dayton in a small town called Xenia that's best known for two things. One is that a tornado leveled half the city many years ago. So you actually see this old Grandesk City Hall right down the street from a Walmart because part of the historic area was preserved, and then it was just leveled, so there was room for basically a strip mall. And it's also very popular in car games because sometimes you need a town that starts with an X, and there aren't very many. By running the Greene County Bureau right before I started, the other job in the Greene County Bureau was eliminated, so I was the only person in the Greene County Bureau, which is why I was the bureau chief. I had this big office with multiple rooms and multiple computers all to myself. But I got to cover everything there. I covered a bunch of villages and towns. I covered courts. I covered crime. I covered colleges. I covered everything going on. And so I got a taste of everything. And eventually I had a chance to move downtown to the main office and work for an editor on the covering business. And I started out covering heavy manufacturing, so steel mills like AK Steel, and car factories. There were, I think, about 9 General Motors plants at the time, including one that made Chevy Blazers. So I got to see stuff actually made, which was really interesting. But during my career, I've always been interested in digging and not just taking things for granted, and really interested in data and finding numbers. So my first job, I actually wound up getting databases, including a database of assessment property tax records and pet license records, so I could figure out what was the most common name for a pet, but on these big spools of magnetic tape that you'd see on a mainframe. So I had to figure out how to decode these big giant spools of tape and get data from it onto the only PC in the newsroom, because we were mostly writing on these little dummy terminals connected to a computer tucked in the corner. But I've had a chance to work at a bunch of different places. At the Globe, I started out covering business again. I covered life sciences, so biotech companies. It was really interesting. And then I moved over and covered banking and financial companies. But when a job opened up on the investigative team as a data reporter, I jumped at the chance. And the Globe didn't even know, I think, that it was a possibility to find somebody inside. They were looking outside, and I aggressively lobbied every editor in the building I could find, sometimes more than once or twice, to let them know that I can do those types of stories, and they gave me a chance. So initially I was splitting my time on a Metro investigative team on the main newsroom and half-time on the Spotlight team, and a year later those two teams merged, so they're bigger than ever, as Patty pointed out.
Okay, great. Let's dig in now a little bit and talk about some of the work that you do at Spotlight. So I took a look at your TIP webpage, and it says, and you stress, that people don't have to identify themselves. You even suggest, and I quote, "If you are worried about protecting your identity, we suggest you avoid using your work email account. For extra security, you can encrypt your note with pretty good privacy." So can you talk a little bit about what you do to sort through the tips that you get, and how do you decide on stories in this day and age when virtually anybody can be a tipster, anybody can be the so-called citizen journalist? How do you start vetting stories?
Well, that's a great question. Well, I became Spotlight editor just as of last May, and I have to tell you, one of the parts of the job I actually really enjoy, although it can be a lot of work, is sifting through the tips. Now, I don't only do it, the other people on the team also do. But, we get, and probably because of the movie, we get just, scores of tips, routinely every month, every week. It comes by email, it comes by snail mail, it comes by telephone calls. We have a tip line. And I have to say, one of the ones I actually have taped to one on the wall in my office, it says to the Spotlight team, and then return address, it just says help. Okay. And that's the kind of thing. Sometimes we get tips from inmates. We get, and some tips are from people who, clearly aren't living in reality too. I mean, everyone who has some, problem writes to us. But I will say that we have a tip sheet now too. And by the way, to everyone here, and I try to do this at everyone we speak to, if you have a tip, I urge you, please, to write to us. You never know when something that you say could be a story. But what we do is we log all the tips. There's a Northeastern student that helps me, and we log them. And so it could be anonymous, but let's say they say that I'm just making this up, the Italian Home for Children has got some problem. We would just log in those words so that if we start seeing a pattern, even if we wouldn't necessarily jump into it right away, but if we see a pattern of tips about the same place, someone says there's misconduct at an agency, we will just log in as much information and then we will go back to it. But basically we sift through that and we hear tips from just general people or things that we read too, and then we try to see what stories are worth our attention.
And how do you sift them out? And how do you sort out things and decide where's the really good story?
Yeah, I mean, any investigation we do should basically have it has a greater Boston area focus, for one thing, that ideally, although there are some exceptions to that, we are at the Boston Globe, so we start here. Many of the issues, though, have national resonance as well. I mean, it'll have repercussions nationally. But it has to be a story that, exposes wrongdoing, holds government accountable. But in the case of race, which we did and spent 6 months on last year, it's an important civic subject, an important social subject, and that we try to bring to it, Todd's our amazing data person. We try to bring data, statistics to an issue that can be about society, and try to just use kind of the rigor of Spotlight to analyze it as deeply as possible. So there's many different definitions.
This isn't always the case, and I say this largely from observation, not being a participant, but a lot of good Spotlight stories are kind of just systemic in nature, too.
Right.
I mean, you worked on the mental health series a couple of years ago. And, a lot of them, including the race series, will be about things that are about sort of broader social issues.
Yes.
One hard thing is that we get so many calls and tips every day from people who want us to tell their individual story or help them with their situation. Maybe they're a parent struggling with probate court and feel that they're not getting a fair deal and trying to hold on to custody of their kids. Maybe they were abused by a teacher years ago. I just talked to a victim of sexual abuse 11 years ago, and unfortunately we can't tell every individual story. In fact, we're very limited in how many Spotlight stories we can do a year, so we try to take on new issues, and we try to take on broader systemic issues, as Adrian said, and find a handful of really good examples to illustrate that broader problem and explain how that broader problem affects people and hopefully bring change that helps everybody rather than just one person.
By the way, many of those individual stories that aren't Spotlight stories will make fine columns, so just like the two of you to keep that in mind.
Exactly. Right. Well, I was actually going to add that frequently the tips we get aren't things that we would do in Spotlight right away, but we give them to Metro reporters. I recently got a tip that had to do with the environment. I give it to the environmental reporter. Recently got a tip about someone who was complaining about racial discrimination in the tenure system. I give it to the higher ed reporter. So it's not as if we just sit on it either. If it can be acted on more quickly, we give it away.
So we've heard a little bit about the series that you did on racism, and I want to talk about that a little bit. This was not only an incredibly difficult topic to tackle, but you also tackled it in an incredibly thoughtful and sensitive way. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the method that you had in going into this, and also sort of high level, what were some of the most important findings that you think this series brought to light?
Well, just by way of background, there were Boston's reputation as a city that is unwelcoming to many black people is something that was made very clear to us by a couple of high-profile things that had happened last year. So we decided to do a deep dive into this subject. and we realized writing about race is so emotional, and that it was important that if we were going to look at racism or race, we had to try to be as data focused as possible and try to rely more on statistics than on anecdotes. So we were trying to get it away from emotion and try to stick to those kinds of data points. Again, Todd played a huge role, all the reporters played a huge role with that emphasis. And so I think what we ended up finding is that even though Boston is perhaps less overtly racist than it was in its worst times during the busing crisis in the 1970s, there were still so many ways in which there were structural and institutional racism, and we tried to show that in some of the major areas like higher ed, hospitals, employment, and so forth.
Some of the most interesting points in the series to me was that one of the things we found was that there were a lot of things you could compare directly. The Globe had done a series on job discrimination in 1983 and compiled a bunch of data about race in hiring and in corporate Boston. And you could compare things like the number of black law partners in the 80s versus now, or things like that, or the number of black college students, for that matter, in the 80s versus now. And one of the things we found was how little had changed. I mean, as somebody who's been at the Globe for a long time and written about race a lot, I was really staggered when you really looked at the data, at how little the needle had moved in so many areas, whether it was healthcare or higher education or development or politics.
And that's absolutely true. One of the things that surprised me was how bad our reputation was. We've all heard jokes. We've all heard anecdotes. One of the things that's spurred us to start looking at this was a crack Michael Che made on Saturday Night Live about looking forward to seeing the blackest city in America beat the most racist city in America. But we sponsored a survey that asked African Americans across the country which city is the most welcoming or unwelcoming to people of color, and Boston was significantly below the other cities. So it wasn't just a few anecdotes. There was actually data showing that we had a real a racist reputation. And we started in doing interviews and looking at other data, seeing real impact on that, seeing that college students were less likely, black college students were less likely to come to Boston. So the numbers of black college students in the Boston area is significantly lower than it is nationwide. I believe it's 7% for Boston area colleges versus 12% nationally at colleges, and it's even lower at elite colleges in the Boston area. We were talking to hospitals that said that doctors are less likely to want to come here when they get medical residencies because they're afraid of the reputation and afraid that they're going to feel alone. We're the whitest metro area of the top 10 largest metro areas, so much so that there are more than 24 cities and towns in Massachusetts that have 0 black residents, according to the census. So Adrian knows this, but a lot of African American residents feel really isolated. And part of what we'd started doing was just counting the number of black people we saw in major venues like Fenway, and where it was often 2%. It's really low. So we learned a lot doing the series.
I mean, one of the recurring themes was that for a lot of black students, or even just, let's say you're coming here from another city, moving here, is the degree of isolation that a lot of black people were experiencing. And I feel like, among the events that we've been invited to, we of course look for things that are good to come out of it. The last weekend I was at there was this thing called the MIT Hackathon for Inclusion. And it was really interesting. There was this amazing group of 10 people who were on the team I was on, came up with this app, and they call it Black Space Boston, and it's meant to kind of be a place where people can go to if they want to find events and so forth, and they're excited about maybe making this happen. So these were some of the good results from this.
Yeah, I think that the whole series is really a fantastic way of starting to have conversations around some really difficult issues, and really thank all of you for your excellent reporting on this topic. I want to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up because I'm sure we have a lot of people who would like to ask you questions as well. But the last question that I want to ask is about some of the changes that we've seen in journalism over the last few years. Do you think that there are ways that you are able to use some of the more interactive features of journalism to make your work more powerful? And do you think that some of the more interactive features of journalism now enable you to share your work more widely?
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, one of the things, the Globe recently moved from Dorchester to downtown, and there's a huge premium on us being a digital-first operation now. And one of the ways is that, I mean, even though we still appreciate the print subscribers and so forth, but we also know that those numbers are dwindling. And so the beauty of, for example, even this series is that, we have a landing page for it. So people can still see it over and over. And, it's not like in the past where you write the story and if you missed it, that's it. You'd have to go to the archives of the library to find it. There's so much more interaction with readers, too, in terms of reader response. I will say, though, speaking of that, there's always the kind of the negative side of that, too, in terms of, the comment boards. And on this series and on a number of more controversial topics, we don't just let the comment board stay up there. I mean, I know that the Washington Post and the New York Times, too, have done things to moderate the comment board because it becomes just a total, it's just these trolls and other sort of nasty language gets in there. So on this series, we debuted this thing called the Choral Board, which you sort of pose a question, but it becomes a moderated forum. Because otherwise you really, you silence dialogue. You don't it's not promoted.
Yeah, and the series also has a Facebook page, which, Spotlight series never used to have, and which we weren't all convinced was a great idea, actually, when we decided to do it. But it's now got 4,000 members, and it sparked a really healthy conversation. And it's another way of keeping the series going that you wouldn't have had 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, and one thing that's really amazed me about the Facebook group is some readers have met each other through that forum and organized meetups at coffee shops and elsewhere just to talk about race. So, I mean, who would have imagined that after the series ran, that a group of strangers across Boston would want to meet up to talk about a subject as sensitive as race with a bunch together, but it's happened again and again and again.
That's fantastic. Well, let's open it up for questions from the audience. We have a mic over here. And one over there, too.
Hi, Nicholas Savale. I'm a sophomore studying English. So I actually saw the Spotlight movie for the first time only about a week ago with a few friends. And I was wondering, as a team that kind of works a bit more, underground, like you've said, you don't share what you're working on. Have you found that the increased attention that the movie's brought to your team, kind of putting you guys in the spotlight, so to speak, has made it harder to do your job? Or has the increased attention and awareness kind of made it easier, giving you guys more options?
Well, I think that's a great question because on one level, of course, the visibility of the word spotlight is great in a sense because people associate it with, hopefully excellent journalism and so forth. But I will say, we've even had this debate internally about when you call someone now, let's say you just call the town clerk of Framingham. Do you say, I'm Tod Wallach of the Spotlight team? Because it's scary, I mean, it's like, let's just say he just wants to find, a number of dog licenses or something. It's scary to hear Spotlight. And so sometimes we want to, and so we even had this sort of debate, well, do you put it on your business card? Do we put it on the website? Do we, because for some people, it might actually make them return your call faster. So it's good. And in other people, it's almost like getting a call from an IRS tax auditor, something, So it can be mixed a little bit.
But we definitely have gotten a flood of tips. Some are really useful, and some are from all around the world, from particularly people who've been affected by the Catholic Church and want us to investigate a case in Australia or the United Kingdom and thinks that's what Spotlight does because that's what the image they got from the movie. So that can be a misperception. But overall, I think it's positive. I think it's created new opportunities. The producers of the film have funded us a Spotlight Fellowship, and I think applications are being accepted through March 31st for a new investigation, and the producers have put up $100,000 each year for a new investigation. So hopefully it's created more opportunities.
Perfect, thank you.
Mike, I'm just curious what fraction of your projects yield a piece? What's your, I can imagine that you would start some investigation and digging and then it goes nowhere.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm just curious about how much of your energy actually ends up yielding a piece.
I know. Well, it can be a gamble. I mean, I've known of investigations that Spotlight has pursued. They might even spend a few months on it, and it doesn't really, they don't write anything because it ended up being perhaps far too complicated. There weren't clear villains and good guys, or, you know what I'm saying? So that can happen. I mean, what we do, though, is a whole vetting process. So you sort of try to vet it as much as possible, and then kind of you sort of know it's worth that extra time. But it's not a perfect science either, yeah.
And there can be a lot of anxiety in spending a few months on a story that you're not sure is going to pan out.
Exactly.
I'm curious, with the series on race, if you all had a vision of what you hope might be changed in Boston from the reporting, the investigation hitting the stands, and whether you've seen in any of the areas that you investigated any evidence of positive change because of the questions, the hard questions you raised in the reporting, which I would like to applaud and really appreciate. It's been, I'm on the left of the left, but it's given my friends and I a lot of things to talk about ourselves. So I've been appreciative, but I haven't known if it's actually done anything out in a more mainstream community.
Well, the last day of the series, day 7, was a day of solutions, in which all of us wrote like 400-word pieces based on the things we had done in the series about, things that might change. And they range from having more candid conversations, in your personal life, to things that might increase political power, like, giving the city council more power, thereby limiting the power of the mayor, to renaming Yawkey Way, which came out of the sports piece and actually might happen. It's now winding its way through City Hall. It's a little early to say definitively what will come out of the series, and I personally don't know that I had a lot of specific ideas about it, but I think the conversation it's generated has been great. I think the energy has been great, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I include this among them. We've been invited to more than 40 different forums to discuss the series, and it's been really gratifying for us, even though it's also take time. Like, we have our normal day jobs still to do our other things, but we are really gratified by these invitations. The Globe even also, it sponsored an event at JFK Library about a week ago. There were like 550 people there. I do think that the idea of starting a conversation, and as you say, these are difficult conversations, has been really important. But I think we all also feel that it's, action's important too. So, but I'm aware, like at MGH, at Brigham and Women's Hospital, I'm aware that they have different sort of working groups. I mean, things are happening, I think, at the ground level in different institutions too. So we may not even know of everything.
I agree with all of that. This was in some ways, a non-traditional Spotlight story. We weren't highlighting a single institution or person that was doing something wrong. Often when we do a major investigative story, we expect people to be immediately fired or proposals to immediately change laws. And this was not that type of series. This is a very large issue that affects everyone, and it's not black and white, despite the topic. But it has gotten so many conversations started. People are trying to figure out how they can make a difference, and I think it has started to make actual changes. I mean, just look at the Globe, which is part of the series, agreed to undertake a bunch of initiatives to look at our own news coverage and also our hiring practices. As part of the series, the editor, Brian McGrory, agreed to make managerial bonuses partly contingent on being able to attract and retain minorities, and change some other practices to make sure that we try to have a more diverse newsroom reflecting the region.
Question about how you bring stories to life. So you work as a group, it sounds like, on a given topic, and can you talk a little bit about just the process of figuring out what gets included, what research is required, who gathers what data, who's writing what pieces of the story, just to help us understand how something actually comes
Well,
from an idea to a...
Right. No, that's great. Right. Well, we basically met weekly, right, as a group, and we would meet, and after every meeting, essentially each person had sort of a task to look at. At some point, fairly, I don't know, within a month or so, like we knew that Adrian was doing the sports day, and he was going to have a role in the day related to power and politics, and so he would go deep on that. And then, Todd doing a lot of data, had a hand in almost every day. And we would have these meetings to go over, what was the new information that was learned and how many days we would do it. It's a constant kind of expansion and contraction process.
Yeah, in the case of this series, we started with sort of a broad idea of looking at Boston's reputation for race and whether it was still deserved and that kind of thing. And then from there we had to sort out what the individual stories would be.
But I will say that it was also a learning process. You're seeing 3 of us here. There was 3 other people, or 4 other people then. Yeah, yes. 4 other people. We were a racially diverse group. We had different expertise. One reporter knew a lot about hospitals. Another reporter, sort of there was all kinds of different backgrounds that we had, and so we would have to discuss things. We got to know each other pretty well, and part of it is being very candid too. There might be a photo that we're thinking of using in the series, and some people like it, some people don't. Certain topics or headlines, some people might find it offensive, some people don't. And so we would discuss all these things.
Todd, I love the series. One of the questions I wasn't able to pose, how does a 17-year-old who's applying to colleges understand that Boston's unfriendly? That's one. And the second thing, how much has Linda's chief operating influence ramped up your staffing and reach and media?
A couple things. Technically, we still do have multiple editions. We have an early edition and a late edition to make some people feel better. So no longer have an afternoon edition, but now we're online, so we're always publishing. So in some ways, I guess we have a different edition every minute because it's always changing. It's interesting, 17-year-olds have access to the internet. They have access to more newspapers than I did when I was 17. Have access to so many television programs and networks, more networks than I had access to when I was 17. They have parents, they have family members who can give them advice, and many of them will say, don't go to Boston. So people get information from lots of different ways. But this is a real perception, and it's a real issue, and it's one of the many reasons why fewer black students are at local colleges.
Well, but see, I think that's one of the very important realizations I had or findings is there's international diversity, and then there's diversity when you're talking about American minorities. I think those can be very different things. And one of the things that I think came out a lot in the higher ed day, look, I'm of Chinese background. It's great seeing more Asian students on campus. But on the other hand, like at places like Northeastern, BU, I'm not sure about Tufts, I mean, the amount of Asian students is enormous, and yet the black student population has been static at like 4%. And of course, we know that money is a factor. You've got private paying, international students in many cases. I think these are real, when you talk about issues in higher ed, and what you have to look at in a really sobering and real way is what counts as diversity. And I'm not saying there's an answer. Maybe, universities like this see yourselves as global citizens of education. You're to educate the whole world, and you're educating the world leaders. But I do think that there can be something said for an institution that accepts, your nonprofit status. You get a lot of tax benefits. You could look at what are you doing for the disadvantaged populations of this country. So I think those are issues that came out, at least in the higher ed day.
Yeah, when you look at colleges from 30 years ago, I mean, they are all more diverse, but it's the black student enrollment that hasn't grown. So it's kind of, how do you define diversity? What is diversity?
Use the mic.
Oh, sure. Hello, my name is Joseph Lim, and I'm part of the investigative journalism team on The Daily. When you're trying to interview sources that are reluctant to give you information, say very important sources, however, are kind of on the other side of the story. Say that when you're trying to make a narrative for a victim and you're trying to get a source from an administration or something, that's how do you conduct an interview that's smart and that doesn't offend the source that you're trying to make an interview with.
Do you mean if you're confronting the official about perhaps how they've mistreated the victim?
Sort of.
Yeah. I think the only way to do it is, and we talked about this during the journalism panel we had before, I think that I don't really worry, honestly, about how I'm affecting anyone's feelings or anything. I mean, I really don't. I think that I just go by this play fair. If we have a victim's report about how they were mistreated, say it was a sexual assault, sexual harassment on campus, let's say, that was ignored. We try our best to make sure the account that they give is accurate. We want to kick the tires on the account too, make sure there's nothing exaggerated or whatever. And then I think you just go to the officials and say, what happened here? You just try to get the facts. And I don't think that we can, worry about alienating anybody or whatever. And that's the way ideally that's the way everything should be. We hold powerful people accountable. That's kind of our job.
Yeah, you have a right to hold people accountable, and you don't have to apologize for it or for asking tough questions.
I think it's amazing that you have an investigative team on the
That
Daily.
too, yeah.
We didn't have an investigative team on my college newspaper, although I'm proud to have done an investigative story, found that the largest organization on campus, Dance Marathon, which had raised a huge amount of money, had never gotten tax-exempt status, had never filed a tax return, and was potentially in big jeopardy because of it. And all because I was curious how much they spent on fundraising and couldn't find their tax forms. But the main thing is, it's just important to give whatever institution you're writing about or person a chance to respond and a chance to give their side of the story. So I don't like to surprise people. I tell them in advance what the story is going to say, what facts we're going to print, and give them a chance to explain it as best they can. And if their explanation doesn't make sense or contradicts obvious facts, I let them know that. And sometimes they don't want to talk at all, and that's fine. That gives me more space.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. I have a question just about the landscape of journalism in Boston right now. The Herald just got bought, as I'm sure you know, by Alden Global Capital, and they've been known to run papers into the ground.
mean, I agree. Having a two-paper town or a competition is definitely good. Even though the Herald's newsroom, I mean, how many reporters do you think they have? It's not many. I mean, in some ways, it's not even a fair fight anymore in that sense. You know? But still, their presence and on certain breaking news, there obviously can be very good. And a lot of people are loyal readers of the Herald. So quite frankly, they call them with tips and things that we might not get. So I hope it does stay a two-paper town, but it is hard, and it's definitely a struggling time for them. Yeah.
And this actually relates to a question that came up earlier. Newsrooms, including the Globe, have seen a diminishment of resources for basic reporting over time. So I think around 2000, the Globe would have had a newsroom around 500. Now it's closer to 220 or 225. Many newsrooms have seen even sharper declines. So the decline in newsrooms across the country have been really significant. And you sometimes don't see that with investment in investigative teams, but you see it on a more daily basis where nobody's going to town meetings, nobody's going to school board meetings, nobody's covering many communities and agencies day in and day out. So many important stories are not being covered.
Let me just ask a related question. Are you at all concerned about convergence in media, that we have fewer and fewer big companies that are owning more and more pieces of media?
You know, I mean, it's so complicated, the financial aspect of the media now. I mean, of course, yes, in that sense. But on the other hand, I will say there's a proliferation of a lot of smaller, scrappier news outlets. You know, even little small investigative online entrepreneurial organizations. It's a complicated picture. I mean, I think there's definitely a downside to some of that consolidation you're talking about. But there's been a lot of great journalism, great stories that have come up in other ways.
If anything, the big newspaper chains are getting smaller and going away, you know. Whatever happened to Knight Ridder, you know, or look at McClatchy, right? They're all, you know, it's half the size it used to be. So in a way, there's less proliferation.
Dean Solomon.
So what are you working on now?
That is the toughest question you can ask Patty Wen. Yeah, right.
Can I ask you to come and use the mic so everybody can hear your question? Thank you.
You all bring different sets of experiences in history. I'm wondering, how do you figure out what profile of skills you need on your team? Because I could imagine it could be quite varied. I mean, you all bring different skills to the table. How do you figure out if somebody fits in, or what do you need?
Right. Well, I can say that, for example, I mean, certain projects, if it's an investigation, let's just say of, you know, a corrupt town official, you just need your really great investigative reporter. I mean, it doesn't matter your own personal background. But for certain stories, like the race story, it certainly helped that a number of people on the team had lived experience. I mean, you know, 2 reporters are African American, had the lived experience, but myself and another reporter, she's from the Philippines, I mean, the story focused on the black community. I'm not black, but on the other hand, you know, as a person of color, you import certain experiences. Certain stories probably, you know, like if it's about sexual assault or whatever, maybe some women would be not so much necessarily maybe better reporters, but maybe in that case, but more that they would get access. A victim would feel more comfortable talking to them. But I will point out, too, that on the race series, we had 4 white reporters, and I'm not saying that's important, too. I mean, because this is a story, the audience for the race series, you could say, is even more, it's important that the white population understand the issues. So to that extent, you know, you don't want to have an entire team that's just all people of color, either, so.
just add one nice thing is that we're a collegial newsroom. We talk to each other. Many of us sit next to each other. So, I've wound up helping people on other stories just because I've heard they're working on it and can make some suggestions on how to get documents or some databases that might be useful. And so teams can expand and contract depending on where the story goes and what expertise is needed.
I think we have time for one more question. Somebody wants to ask
I
one.
think she had her hand up. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm in Steve Cohen's education class in School and Society right now, and we've just spent the past few weeks studying the Boston desegregation crisis. And I was just wondering whether you saw the repercussions of, desegregation in Boston, spill over into what you've been researching for the racism series.
Well, many people would say, although I don't think it's true, that the city's bad reputation for race really begins with the desegregation crisis. And, I think that our reporting showed that it really predates that, but certainly it was something that has had a huge effect on the city and the way it's perceived, and it continues to. One of the reasons to think that when racist incidents happen in Boston, they reverberate in a way they don't happen, in a way they don't in other cities, is because of that sort of legacy and Boston's reputation dating to that of being racist.
But I mean, there was forced busing in other cities that also created problems, but not to the degree necessarily that it happened in Boston. So you do have to say, is there something about Boston that made that happen? There was one more question over here. Did you do something?
So, in this era of fake news and distrust in the media, how do you mitigate those factors within your investigation? Do you feel like there's this added burden of legitimacy that you have to prove in your investigations?
Well, I feel like we've always felt the burden of really proving it in that sense. I don't think that burden has changed in that sense, but so I feel just as strongly as ever that we have to meet that certain burden of proof in order to write the piece. But I will say that in terms of the era of fake news, I mean, we have to be really careful that we're not victims of fake tips, fake news, exaggerations. I mean, I'm very wary of that, that we not get manipulated also.
Well, this has been really terrific. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists from Boston Globe Spotlight team.